Bonsoir à tous, je suis Floriane Morin. Au nom de Claire Brison, d'Olivier Schintz et de l'ensemble de notre comité scientifique, nous vous souhaitons la bienvenue au premier événement qui inaugure le colloque Provenance globale. Nous vous convions aujourd'hui à un entretien dédié au respect des droits des peuples autochtones et à la responsabilité des musées. Notre invité est Kristen Carpenter, professeure de droit et de propriété culturelle à l'Université du Colorado et présidente du mécanisme d'experts sur les droits des peuples autochtones auprès des Nations Unies. C'est Carine Durand, conservatrice en chef du MEG et anthropologue sociale, spécialiste des processus de collaboration entre les musées et les peuples autochtones, qui discutera avec Kristen et accueillera ensuite vos questions et commentaires. Cet entretien se fera en anglais. N'hésitez pas à utiliser le fil de discussion pour poser vos questions ou lever votre main virtuelle après l'entretien. Carine, je te laisse la parole.
Good evening, everyone. Good morning for some of you. It's a very great pleasure to welcome Kristen Carpenter with us this evening. I've been looking forward to this discussion for quite some time now, and I really wish to thank Kristen for offering us this opportunity to address the question of human rights and museums. Maybe as a matter of introduction, I would like to briefly address the topic of the day, which is the relationship between Indigenous peoples and museums. Over the past 40 years, as Indigenous peoples have become actively engaged in the human rights movement around the world, the relationship between Indigenous peoples and museums has begun to change. More recently, the processes of decolonization of museums and their collections that we have witnessed has been largely influenced by Indigenous peoples' claims over the control of their cultural heritage held in museums. And since the adoption of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples in 2007, museums have become increasingly aware that Indigenous peoples leads the way towards a global human rights culture. And in our discussion, Kristen will certainly provide many insights on the way Indigenous peoples have worked to assert their voices in the human rights movement and how they have strongly influenced it. I wish to explore here with how this human rights approach may, and I would say indeed should, influence our museums and our responsibilities towards the recognition of Indigenous peoples' cultural rights. So maybe my first question to you, Kristen, has to do with your own experience. You wear a number of hats, first as a UN expert, but also as a law professor and advisor to both museums and Indigenous peoples. So how do these experiences inform your perspective on museums more generally? And maybe how do this experience inform your perspective on their responsibilities towards the recognition of Indigenous people's rights? Thank you. There is a problem with your mic, Kristen. Here we go. Thank you, Kristen. You have the floor.
Thank you. Et merci beaucoup, Carine. Pour commencer, autant que vous êtes à Genève, je voudrais dire en français que je suis très contente d'être avec vous aujourd'hui et que je souhaite remercier le musée de m'avoir invité au séminaire Provenance globale, un événement qui est très important pour nous tous dans le domaine des musées, des droits de l'homme et des peuples du monde entier. To continue in English, thank you for the question, Carine. I'm glad to be here with you in this important conversation for all of us in museums, human rights, and people around the world. I do wear a number of hats, and despite all of these professional experiences, I think the biggest influence on my understanding of the potential of museums came from my mother. And I think she's actually viewing from the United States. And she was a museum professional when I was growing up. Many at that time viewed the museum primarily as a repository for collections, but she always had a progressive view of their societal dimensions. In her understanding, the museum was part of the community and should serve it as a dynamic institution with multiple cultures, languages, and peoples, Indigenous and immigrant, local and global. Yet during this time in the 1990s and early 2000s, my mom was a rare museum professional, and in many places, cultural and racial minorities could only see themselves as objects of curiosity, figures in a diorama under the glass versus active participants in museum interpretation, programming, and leadership. When I became a lawyer and professor and UN expert, as you said, Carine, I came to understand that there are legal norms and values around these points. In many places, museums are state or national institutions. They have not only a social or ethical role, but a legal one in realizing human rights obligations, whether that is the right of minorities to enjoy their cultures, as in the International Covenant of Civil and Political Rights, or as you already said, the rights of Indigenous peoples to cultural objects and human remains that have been taken from them under the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Museums, depending on their areas of focus, are often at the front lines of these issues, as in the French study and recommendations regarding repatriation to African countries for items taken from them during the colonial period. But there's a gap that I often find between human rights advocates and museum professionals. Both are deeply trained in their own fields, whether that's law or museology, and both usually bring tremendous goodwill, but sometimes they lack a shared vocabulary to talk about common values and challenges facing them in today's society. So hopefully our conversation and the Q&A is an opportunity for such a conversation and to advance some mutual discourse and understanding around these issues.
Thank you, Kristen. I felt very interesting what you said right now, right now about the gap. We'd like maybe to pick up on this gap you've just mentioned between human rights advocates and museum professionals. And this lack of shared vocabulary that could be very interesting to us, I think, in our discussion. And maybe I would like to address this through another topic I know that you've been following very closely these years, which is the culturally sustainable museum. And so I'm quite interested in having your view on these culturally sustainable museums, which maybe will fulfill its role in terms of human rights obligations. And I would be quite curious to know how you would merge these two things, human rights obligation and what is it to be and to develop a museum into a sustainable way culturally, if you can expand on this.
Sure. This concept of the culturally sustainable museum is one that I learned about from the Sami people through a series of exhibitions in 2018 and 19 they had at Sida, the Sami Museum in Inari, Finland. And the practice, as I understand it, is of a museum engaged not only in cultural possession and study, but also cultural exchange, production, and expression. The culturally sustainable museum is a place where culture is flowing in multiple directions, where the museum is not only holding or extracting or owning culture, and particularly of others or without their consent, but acting as a steward in relationship with others in a way that uplifts and supports constituents in a non-coercive and non-appropriative manner. I know these sound like abstract ideas, so let me put a little bit of specificity on them. So a culturally sustainable museum could be a caretaker of cultural objects, which are not only held behind the glass, but potentially available for study or borrowing by constituent communities. And I know many museums are already doing exactly this. In some of the museums in the United States that I've worked with or been a board member of or visited, they have really active partnerships with Indigenous peoples. So for example, the Museum of the Cherokee Indian in North Carolina has provided opportunities for contemporary Indigenous fashion designers to come study very old textiles. When I was there, young women were learning about feather cape and twine skirts, which they then incorporate in new clothing, in new contemporary Cherokee clothing. In this way, the museum moves from a static role of cultural objectification to a more progressive role in cultural production. There are lots of examples of such borrowing, participation, and production. And I think it's important to note that these practices are sustainable not only from the Indigenous people's perspective, but for museums as well. In many cases, the museums I work with are having to re-examine their operating models given changing demographics. Historically, or even recently, the collector, donor, member, and visitor community has been somewhat homogenous and not terribly diverse, at least in terms of US understandings of race, class, and ethnicity. But today, economic realities and the competition for public attention with so much media and entertainment means that museums cannot rely on their historic constituencies or count on a captive audience. To survive, they need to appeal to a more diverse community. And if they work with Indigenous peoples and other people of color as leaders, partners, and provide more points of interaction through interpretation, programming, and otherwise, they often find themselves more relevant, more engaged, and more sustainable in terms of visits, exhibitions, donors, and investors. And then finally, Carine, one trend I'll mention just because it's so relevant to what we're all going through today during COVID is the engagement of museums in online communications and research. And your seminar here, I think, is a perfect example. Many museums, I think, in communities are taking on their role as hosts for difficult but intentional and important community conversations. For example, about historical trauma that may be buried in dominant narratives, but is actually living in the museum's collection. And you know these examples as well as I do, but whether it's art looted during the Holocaust or acquired during the colonization of Africa, these are deeply painful but pervasive topics affecting descendants today. And museums are uniquely situated because they often hold the items in their possession, have access to the provenance, so they have a basis to ground conversations, bringing together constituencies with shared interests in caring for precious items and hopefully in reconciling relationships. And I think one perhaps silver lining of our COVID experience is that we can come together across the globe in conversations that are otherwise, harder to do, although of course important to visit local communities whenever possible as well.
Well, thank you so much for this extensive reply. It's so fascinating. Actually, I'm very fascinated by your approach of the museum as a caretaker. And I was so interested in this point of caretaking and stewardship, to shift from ownership to stewardship.
Yes.
And I'm very interested in this approach of the museum as a caretaker, which actually may be able to host difficult conversations. And I was thinking possibly one of the most difficult and painful conversation we may have, of course, in the museums is related to the preservation and exhibition of sensitive materials. So I know you've been, and I would like you maybe to expand on this a bit more. You've been very much involved as a chair of the expert mechanism on the rights of Indigenous peoples. You've been very much involved in all discussion and debates and approach to human rights and human rights approach actually to repatriation. And maybe if you could say a bit more, what was your role as a chair of the EMRIP and how the EMRIP is engaged in this field?
Yes, thank you, Carine. And I remember that's when I first had the opportunity to meet you when EMRIP was working on these issues and holding a seminar in Canada. So just to back up a little bit, maybe, I am a member of the UN's expert mechanism on the rights of Indigenous peoples, and I was the chair through this year, and the new chair is Lila Vars, a Sami woman from Norway. But part of my portfolio has been the cultural rights work of EMRIP. And our mandate is to help states and Indigenous peoples realize the aims of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And the Declaration recognizes that Indigenous peoples have a right to repatriate human remains as well as cultural objects. Some who haven't been as deeply immersed in this work as you have may wonder why Indigenous peoples' remains, that is their bodies, are in museums in the first place. For hundreds of years all around the world, Indigenous peoples' skulls and bones, sometimes even their flesh, hair, clothing with bloodstains of adults and children have been excavated by archaeologists and anthropologists, treated as artifacts akin to a pottery shard or an arrowhead, and transferred to museums for their collections. The history in the US is the one I know best. In the 1800s, the Surgeon General and the Army both ordered officers and soldiers to collect these items, sometimes freshly killed, other times from grave sites, and transfer them to the National Museum for study. By the 1980s, the Smithsonian Museum had 18 or 19,000 such human remains in its collection, and Indigenous peoples were becoming increasingly active in the self-determination movement, asserting their rights in a whole realm of areas, including culture and, of course, human dignity. And so federal legislation was passed, a National Museum Act, and also the National Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, requiring museums to return these remains to the tribes of origin. Of course, the statutes are more complicated than that, and we can talk about the way they work, maybe if people are interested in the Q&A. But this was in 1990, and I will say that over the last 30 years, the US has really changed a lot in terms of practice, where human remains are no longer treated as artifacts, but are treated as humans, as ancestors, as relatives who deserve a decent burial. And we also have an understanding of the significance of cultural objects used for ceremonial purposes to this day, sometimes having a living spirit because they've been consecrated in religious ceremonies. And the difficult thing, to go back to that gap of understanding, is that even when museum professionals are personally sympathetic, and I think they often are, the law of a country may treat museum collections as national property. And museum ethics, as you well know, often militate against deaccessioning. And so the museum attorney may opine that repatriation can only occur if there's proof the item was taken illegally, if there's been a state-to-state request under international conventions, such as the UNESCO Convention of 1970, and so on. If I can take just a couple of minutes, Carine, maybe to share a best practice that EMRIP
yes, please do. Yes,
worked
please.
on. Okay, great. Because again, I know this can all be very abstract, but in 2020, maybe one of the highlights of 2020 for me at least, EMRIP worked with the country of Sweden and the Yaqui people, a cross-border people of Mexico and the United States, regarding a long-standing request to repatriate their sacred masakova, a ceremonial living deer head that had been acquired by Danish anthropologists in the 1930s when the Yaqui people had been driven from their home during the Yaqui Wars. They were living in an army garrison and very diminished in their ability to protect their cultural and religious items. This masakova came into the possession of the Swedish National Museums of World Culture, which, while very sympathetic, I think felt constrained by some of these laws. With the encouragement and persistence of the Yaqui people, the Swedish museums came to embrace a human rights approach to the question, taking a real leadership role in seeing things differently. The UN Declaration's Articles 11, 12, and 31 provide for repatriation of ceremonial objects as a matter of culture, religion, and property. And also, I think this is a super important point, the Declaration recognizes that Indigenous peoples' own laws are relevant in determining whether an item was taken inappropriately and how it should be handled today. As a matter of Yaqui law, the masakova was inalienable. It belongs to the Kalencias, a religious society of Yaqui people. And also this fact that the anthropologists had acquired the Matsakova during a time when the Yaqui people were subjugated. So with these and other points of provenance better understood, the museum and the Yaqui people gathered in Canada last year. We spent 2 years working on sort of a common discourse, a common understanding of the history and the culture. And EMRIP facilitated a dialogue between them, ultimately leading to an agreement in principle to repatriate, the Matsakova. And the agreement takes into account both the UNESCO Convention and the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, both the laws of Sweden and the laws of the Yaqui people. And it was a very moving event happening in person, and both sides are looking forward to the repatriation post-COVID, hopefully, leading to a human rights approach and collaborations going forward. And I'll say just in closing, this is one example, but there are hundreds, there are thousands of items like the Matsakova or human remains in museum collections still. And EMRIP has recommended the development of a global process to facilitate dialogue and repatriation and collaboration more broadly, feeling that this example may give rise to understanding and modalities for engagement along these lines. And both the Yaqui matter and our report you contributed to, Carine, and thank you, are available, I think, on your conference website if people are interested in more detail.
Yeah, it will actually, totally. Thank you so much, Kristen. At this point, actually, I would like to open questions to you, to you all, to the audience. I think that Kristen has brilliantly touched upon several important subjects. For example, we started with the question of the shared vocabulary still missing between human rights advocates and museum professionals. Something you also mentioned, in order for museums, in order to remain relevant and to survive, we should definitely become more insistently caretaker of cultural objects and shifting from ownership to stewardship. I was also thinking about the Matsakova case, and I remember we had these discussions during the seminar we attended to last year together. Many indigenous peoples were mentioning that there was a formidable barrier, kind of this burden, the burden of the proof that was when indigenous peoples are putting claims for repatriation, they too often have to demonstrate to prove that the items were taken illegally. So this burden of the proof, I think, could be, in fact, a barrier. And then I think you showed us very well as well that a human rights approach to repatriation is closely related to the recognition of indigenous peoples' own laws. I think it was just fantastic to listen to you talking about this. So I would like to ask to all listeners, you're 78 people, so which is fantastic, if you would like to just join us in our conversation. So please feel free to ask questions. You can use the Q&A, or you can also raise hands if you would like to ask questions directly to Kristen. You're most welcome to do it. And students, of course, you're very much welcome to ask questions as well. So please just join us. I can see your hand raising already, which is great. Just going to try and give you the floor, if I can manage the tools things. Han is asking a question, Anne Navanchy.
Can you hear me?
Yes, you have the floor, Anne.
Oh, okay, thank you. Sorry,
welcome.
my
mic.
Yeah, thank you, Kirsten, for your highly interesting talk and what you proposed. I was wondering, listening to you, it's quite interesting the problem maybe of shared terminology, finding a shared terminology. Also, I am an anthropologist, also for anthropologists, and not just from using professionals who also are anthropologists sometimes. I know. But maybe I'm not quite sure about this. It's just an ongoing thought. I wondered about not only a shared terminology, but also to share objectives and clarify also the aims of displaying objects or items, cultural items, which is also maybe a quite important issue, not only the terminology, but also what are we aiming to, what do we want to have, and also the issue of co-constructing such understandings of the objectives.
Thank you, and that's a great question and a difficult one. And you're right that it's not just terminology, but the underlying values and understandings that are often at issue. I think a human rights perspective does open some ways of thinking about things that may, I hope, cut across some different frameworks. One of them is this idea of human dignity, which is really the core of the human rights project. And of course, the whole human rights system arose, at least in the West, in a post-World War II time to protect individuals, but also increasingly communities against abuses to their lives, to their human dignity. Now, there are a set of objectives that museums have often pursued, including not only collection, but conservation, preservation, education, public access, information dissemination. And sometimes those do appear in conflict. For example, if Indigenous peoples are requesting repatriation of a sacred object, the museum might say, well, then how are we going to educate the public about its significance to the culture? And that's a good question. But if we could come back to this maybe underlying or fundamental universal value of human dignity, maybe we could say, okay, how are we going to meet that mission about education in a way that honors human dignity first? And in some of the cases that I've worked with, the Indigenous people who come to visit their item, they may come to bring prayers, they may want to cover the item with a blanket, they may burn sage to, honor it as a relative. But they may also provide information. There's a famous and sort of funny story in the US about Indigenous people coming to view a collection, and the museum person said, oh, we're here to show you these baskets. And the Indigenous people said, actually, they're hats, right? And they flipped them over. I realize that's, sort of a trite example, but sometimes Indigenous people bring information that by respecting them can actually enhance the interpretive or the programming mission. And without that step toward human dignity, the museum would actually be less able to meet its mission of education and access. So I guess I'm suggesting that this is all a process, and I don't have easy answers, but I think that if we can accept human dignity in the rights perspective, in the museum world, in the anthropology world, and so on as a fundamental value, maybe some of the other conflicts will be able to be addressed in a good way.
I see there's a question from Florian, I think.
Yeah, thank you. I'm reading to you a Q&A commentary. Kristen, it's from Lise, and I read it in English. I'm sorry for my bad accent, but I think there is an institutional gap between institutions, but there is as well still resistance to a RBA in museums, because this means these institutions have to question their very existence. Isn't this gap political?
Yes. I mean, that's a very complicated question, but the answer is definitely yes. The political dimensions of these questions are huge. And I think they're political in the sense that there are many entrenched stakeholders that we're talking about. And for example, when I work with museums, the museum director or curator, may be very sympathetic herself, but she may have a board of directors, she may have a national, Bureau of Culture, there may be the president of the country, who all have a political agenda or, multi-generations of ways of doing things that they don't want to disrupt. So the museum, I think, is definitely a political creature and a political institution like all others. And this is where perhaps my training as a lawyer makes me not afraid of those issues, because everything we deal with in Indigenous rights is political. We're talking about the most vulnerable minority trying to assert its rights, which is always going to have political as well as legal dimensions. I think for those who come from a different background, that may seem very disruptive and threatening, but hopefully most of these processes take a very long time. We're not usually talking about dramatic change overnight. As I was mentioning, in the United States, this took 30 years of conversation around NAGPRA, and we're still working on it today. So I guess the short answer is yes, these issues are very political. And yes, I think we still need to work through them with that context in mind.
Kristen, there is a question for you from Clara Pfeiffer. I'm going to read it to you. Thank you for your intervention. It's absolutely interesting. I was wondering about your opinion on the legitimacy of directly taking stolen items out of the museums. Pan-Africanist advocates, which is called Mwazulu Diabanza, does this in French museums. And since it doesn't benefit of the indigenous status, is it legitimate? The discussion between me not being indigenous, is it legitimate in its way of doing this? She's thanking you a lot to answer this question.
Well, these are also good questions, and I appreciate such a thoughtful set of participants. So in my cultural property teaching, we think a lot about questions of legitimacy and frameworks for distributing entitlements, is how we put it in law. Who has a right to these items? And then when it comes to repatriation, also who has a right to them? And there are different frameworks. I think the dominant one has been cosmopolitanism, the idea that cultural property belongs to all humankind. And so whether it's in Paris or Gabon or wherever, all human beings should have access to it. And that it doesn't really matter where the location is, as long as it's in the common public discourse. There's increasingly, there's always been a tension with nationalism, where countries have said, well, we want our cultural property to be in our country. And so the case of the Greek Parthenon marbles is the classic one, where they're in the British Museum, but Greece has said, no, those are our marbles. We want them to come back to Greece. And then there's another layer when it comes to indigenous peoples in Africa as well as around the world, where they're saying, well, neither cosmopolitanism nor nationalism addresses our concerns, which go to our existence and identity as peoples, as particularized. In the US, that might be Cherokee or Hopi. In Africa, it might be Khoisan, or it might be Ogiek. You know, there are thousands of indigenous peoples there too. These questions, I think, ultimately as an indigenous rights advocate, I do hold up the right of indigenous peoples to assert that they too have an interest, which shouldn't be dominated solely by the cosmopolitanism and national or even regional in the Pan-African context, that at least their own interests should be considered. There are, however, you know, some claims that I can understand for regionalism. And when you're talking about practical issues of access, there may be places, countries in Africa that are better situated to have museums and facilities, and perhaps themselves act as a caretaker as more localized peoples are developing their capacity to receive their items back. I think some of these will be processes that occur over time. There's so many interesting questions we could discuss forever here. I mean, there are lots of questions in terms of the exhibition and programming about how you situate items, whether they're in a time frame or a region or a, you know, certain style of production or materiality. And we probably don't have enough time to discuss all of those, but I think they would all enter into this conversation as well.
Oh, thank you so much. That was a very comprehensive reply. Yeah, it's a shame we don't have enough time to detail all this. We're almost ending the time, actually. So please just feel free to ask maybe a last question if you feel like it. Otherwise, I think I will hand over the microphone to Florian, maybe to end up our conversation. I really want to thank Kristen for all the time we spent together. It was short, but very intense, very interesting. And thank you very much to all of you for participating to this event and this first webinar of the colloque Provenance Globale. Many thanks. Thank you, Kristen.
Thank you, and thank you, Carine, for including me and inviting me. And to you and Florian, I wish you much good luck with the rest of the seminar, and hopefully I'll be in Geneva to see you in person before too long.
Thank you. We hope so.
Je vous remercie beaucoup. Nous avions une dernière question dans le Q&A, mais je pense qu'on va l'envoyer directement à Kristen pour qu'elle puisse peut-être interagir avec la personne qui l'a posée dans un email, parce que malheureusement, nous arrivons à la fin de notre entretien. Et nous remercions, nous les organisateurs, infiniment, Kristen et Carine, et vous tous pour votre participation à cet échange qui, par son contenu, annonce l'ambition de notre colloque. Les prochains webinaires se dérouleront les 27 et 28 janvier, ainsi que le 2 février. Et ils aborderont des thématiques très diverses, mais qui cherchent toutes à questionner la relation que les institutions patrimoniales entretiennent ou devraient entretenir avec les communautés d'origine. Alors, je vous donne rendez-vous le 27 janvier à 13h30 pour le premier panel dédié à la recherche en provenance suisse et les contextes coloniaux. Merci à tous.